All right, everybody, welcome to a another esoterical live stream, but an interesting one, and I hope, and a special one. I'm really excited to be joined by Jared Henderson, a fellow philosopher. Which I don't know about you, Jared. I always feel like we're the only field where you can't say what you're trained to be without sounding like a pretentious bad person. You know, if you're trained as a plumber and you say you're a plumber, no one thinks twice about it. But you trained as a philosopher and you say you're a philosopher, people think that you're a complete hack out of the gate. But we're both trained. We both have PhDs in philosophy, and what we want to talk about tonight a little bit is just sort of what it means to be do philosophy, live a philosophical life outside of the academy. Because I think both of us are pretty committed to that, and yeah, I'm kind of curious about getting a conversation about that. But Jared, do you mind saying just a couple of things about yourself and talk maybe a little bit about your channel?
Yeah, I'm Jared Henderson. You can find my channel over just by googling my name or searching for it in YouTube. I talk about philosophy. I talk about books. I talk about writing, journaling. I'm a little less focused, I think, than what you do on your channel, Justin, where you've got like a really nice niche. You kind of go for it. I tend to kind of talk about whatever's interesting me that day when I record. Sometimes I prepare longer ones, but for people who like your channel, I think they might be interested in the fact that like I've talked about stoicism quite a bit. I just did a fairly long video about stoicism, trying to talk about the weirder parts of the history of stoicism, the stuff that maybe you wouldn't pick up if you were watching, 10-minute motivational videos. In general, it's just more about how to live a kind of philosophical or sort of intellectually curious life. That's the kind of, I think, driving theme behind my channel, which is especially fitting, I guess, for this conversation because all the people I'm talking to, the vast majority of them, I guess, are not going to be academics. They have no pretension of it. Many of them are well past their university days, but uh, they're still intellectually interested in things. Like they want to do serious thinking and they want to do serious reading, and that's the kind of stuff that I try to talk about.
Yeah, and I think this is a thing I guess I would come out of the gate with and say is that academic philosophy is just one very narrow way of doing philosophy, and it actually may not even be the best way to living a philosophical life. And that maybe is a controversial thing I'll say, and maybe that will make some academic philosophers angry. But I think the professionalization of philosophy may be inimical to an actual philosophical life. And one of the things I like about what you do on your channel is, you know, you want to really cultivate living a philosophical life, and that is a life of the mind and a life of dedicated to learning and a life of like reflection. And I really think that one of the neat things we can maybe talk about tonight is that it might be the case that because we've escaped we've got an escape orbit from the academic philosophy, that it gives us an interesting way into talking about it that is very different from educated lay people or autodidacts, but also
Mm-hmm.
is very different than you know the smoker at the AAR or at
Yeah,
the the or whatever the American Philosophical Society. Like we're not either one of those, and
yeah,
so I think
yeah.
we have a unique, maybe a unique perspective to offer folks into that. But I guess before we get to there, how do we get into this? How did we get into doing philosophy? How do we ended up? Sometimes I have to admit that I wake up and like, the hell did I end up with a PhD in philosophy?
Yeah.
What mistakes did I make in my life to have merited such an ignominious thing? But how'd you get into this game? How'd you get into the philosophy game at the academic level? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, it really started when I was applying to go to college. I actually was, I think I'm one of the rare ones who chose to become a philosophy major as I was applying to schools. I didn't transfer into becoming a philosophy major. My experience is that most people become philosophy majors like their sophomore year because that's when they learn a little bit about philosophy. And admittedly, this is not going to make me look particularly good. I just was like, what is the major that sounds like people would think like, wow, that guy must be really smart, but that didn't require with me doing like a lot of math or something. Then the fact that I became basically a logician for a while makes that especially funny. But I guess, I mean, in all seriousness, what had happened, I think, is that I had like learned about these guys called philosophers, and there were like a few names that I picked up in high school. Nietzsche was one of them. Heidegger was one of them. I don't know why I only chose like problematic Germans at first, but then John Locke I think came up because I was watching the show Lost at the time, and like there were characters named after philosophers like randomly, and I don't know, I just like heard these names and I started digging, and I started going to the philosophy section of my like local bookstore. This was like a Borders, and just picking out whatever they had and trying to read it. And something struck me about the fact that like philosophers were asking the questions that I had at least sometimes tried to ask, and no one else took them seriously. There were these questions that I had wanted to spend time thinking about. I remember becoming like really politically conscious. By the time I turned 18, I could vote in a presidential election, and I started like wondering like what is it to be like a president? What is it to have like power? What is it to have like authority? And I feel like those weren't the questions that anyone else was asking. They were just asking like, who should I vote for? At least at the time, and I went to like a really small rural high school. I grew up in Ohio, just a small town, and I wasn't encountering these kinds of discussions, but I could find them if I read philosophers. So then I went to school, went to college, and I just kept finding new things about philosophy that I like really loved. I don't think I ever took a subject when I was studying philosophy that I didn't love. There were ones that I liked the least or less, but like I took a medieval philosophy class my freshman year that I maybe wasn't quite ready for. um,
Wow, no one that
it,
should. I'm sorry that happened to
yeah,
you.
yeah, I'm trying to actually make sense of like the ontological argument, and that's hard to do now, and it was like especially hard to do when I was 19. Um, and I don't know, I just kept finding new things, and I was just like so struck by the fact that this field was just full of what I took basically to be like interesting people asking interesting questions and trying to like earnestly answer them. And yeah, you can find that probably in other fields too, but so there was partly just the contingency of just like I showed up in philosophy and that's where I landed. But also, I just found the questions that I was most interested in just ended up being the ones that I could get away with asking if I stayed in a philosophy department.
That makes sense. I mean, I think I ended up in philosophy basically because I was reading a bunch of really strange books about ghosts and the Bermuda Triangle and stuff, and the Dewey Decimal System in the library. It's that stuff, and then philosophy is right after it. And I still remember the day where I was at my like local library and looked up and saw Aristotle Metaphysics,
Mm,
and I was like, I know that guy's name, and I know vaguely what metaphysics is. Um, that must be good. And first paragraph, I felt pretty confident. Third book in, I'm no longer confident. I had no idea what he was talking about anymore.
you're like
And
being is
there was
said in
something,
many ways. That sounds right, but
yeah, yeah. I'm like, yeah, being a seven anyways. Okay, yeah, I get that. And then when he gets into it was just it was a mess of a book. It still is a mess of a book, honestly. And yeah, that was my way in. It was like it was an extension of these weird childhood interests I had. And then it's one thing to read a Time Life book about magic crystals and they speculate about a bunch of stuff. It's another thing when someone spends 10 solid books going carefully through an argument. I'm like, okay, this is actually rigorous thinking, and
Mhm.
so that drew me in, and I tell people, I literally just hung around in philosophy until I ended up on the other side of the podium. It's a complete, I grew up poor working class kid. I had no pretensions of even going to college. By the time that I ended up, I was like, look, if they keep putting money in my bank account, I'm going to keep staying in here. And they kept
Yeah,
doing it until eventually the money was coming from the university, and I was on the other side of the podium. And I was like, okay, um,
yeah.
I'll keep doing this. Um, so I guess the question that comes to mind, right, is that you and I have both have our critiques of academic philosophy. We both left, right? We both decided for whatever reason, for lots of reasons, and we'll get into those reasons in a minute, maybe. But we decided, but it wasn't for us. What I want to do before we sort of go into why we left and maybe our critiques of academic philosophy is I want to focus a little bit on what the good is, because I do think there
Oh
is
yeah,
good
yeah,
in,
yeah.
in doing academic philosophy, and I do think that there are problems with the autodidact route, and I do think there are problems with coming at philosophy as like an interested layperson. I think that
Hmm.
you end up with there are dangers there. But I'm wondering, when you think back on your experience in graduate school, when you separate off all the things that were not so great, and when you come back, what do you look back on and say, this is a thing that academic philosophy gets right? This is a thing that we should do in terms of academic philosophy education or what have you? What do you miss? What do you think the
Yeah.
academy does right?
Yeah. So one, I think that being in a philosophy department is one of the most guaranteed ways that where you're going to end up in a room that's just like concentrated full of very curious people. And they might not always be the most intellectually honest about answering a question or something, but in general, actually, I found that lots of philosophers are just really curious. And so you could raise a problem that they had never encountered before on a subject that previously they wouldn't have said they cared about. And then if you raise it and make it interesting, they really want to pursue it. When when I was in graduate school, I mean, I loved my graduate program, and we had two kind of rotating events that we did all the time. One of them was we had weekly brown bags with the whole department, grad students and faculty, where we would just someone would present a work in progress for 30 minutes, and then we would just ask questions for 30 minutes. And so that meant I had like the oldest, most esteemed professors in my department by the time I was in like my third year or so, just earnestly asking me about my project and about the things I was working on, even if they weren't on my committee, and they would just really take me seriously. And in exchange, I did that for other graduate students. I did that for faculty. There was just this level of sort of like working together to just answer or to just pursue interesting questions. And we even had a thing in my department for only graduate students to do that too. It's sort of like a smaller version. We called it the GRU bag, which is a bit of an obscure reference for your analytic philosophy people. But we had the GRU bags going on, and look, those were great too. I loved those. So just being able to be around really curious people, but also one of the key sort of benefits you get if you study philosophy in an academic setting is having that advisor and having like that mentorship. And I know we probably want to talk about this later about the pitfalls of studying on your own, but the one thing you're going to miss out on the most is having someone like that. You and I are members essentially of one of the few remaining like guild systems in the in the world, where we have a phase where you go through your novice phase and then you're like a journeyman, and or like you get to train up with them under a master, and then you get to go and pursue it, and then you get sort of earn various levels of status. And we sort of opted out eventually of the earning levels of status part, but that idea that what you do to become great at something is to find an expert who will take you on. That is like the single biggest benefit of going to graduate school in general. And one of the things I really miss is that kind of those kinds of close intellectual relationships. And there's lots of other things you could said. I just think like in a well functioning in philosophy department, there's just a level of like dynamism, just interesting ideas that are bouncing off each other, and suddenly a new interesting idea emerges because of the weird tensions between a couple of views that have like come across the hall or something. But the one thing I would mention though are like those communal aspects, that working together and then having a mentor.
Yeah, I agree. Like a structured community of curiosity is a super important part of that. Just community in general. We're all living in a crisis of loneliness, especially men. Men are experiencing a severe crisis of loneliness, and I think that intellectual loneliness is a particular kind of devastating loneliness. Because if you're really excited about something intellectually, the one thing you want to do is share it, and if you don't have anyone to share it to, because your poor wife is not interested in, God bless her heart, is not interested in the ins and outs of Duns Scotus, and it's not her fault
Mm-hmm.
because no one should be probably, um, but you are, and there's no one else. It can be devastatingly lonely, and I think that that's having a community of curiosity is an important thing. Also, I'll say institutional knowledge, just that in somewhere in your department, even if they don't know the answer, they can like email the Duns
Yeah.
Scotus person or whatever,
Yeah.
and having that that network of knowledge and institutional knowledge is super important. I think another thing about academic philosophy is that whether you like it or not, very granular studies of a topic that are very intensive uh, are great, and the end result of that is some kind of synthetic exercise, whether that's
Yeah.
a paper or something else. Because I don't know about you, but my experience is I can sit through a seminar and I think I know what's going on until I have to sit down at a keyboard and like rehearse the actual argument and go through the literature and see if I really do know what's going on. And
Yeah.
I think there's a function of our brain that overcompensates for how much we think we understand
Mhm.
until you have to do that synthetic work. And I think the autodidact rarely ever has to do that step. And then there's just deadlines. Like I'm a person who is extremely pro deadline, and I love the idea that the semester is going to begin and it's going to end. And if you have a being in time seminar, it's going to end,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you're going to get through half of it, and you're going to have to write a paper, and it's coming. And there's no kicking the can down the road. And the people who do kick the can down the road are people who ultimately never leave graduate school.
Mhm.
But there's just no way to like negotiate with it in the same way that you can, as an autodidact or whatever, as an outsider, you can sort of spiral out in a way that looks like learning and curiosity, but doesn't have the same intellectual concentrated rigor. So those are things I think I will miss is that sort of, taking, whatever stoicism, and you have one semester to do stoic physics, and that's all you're going to do, and you're going to exhaust the field as far as possible.
Yeah.
And I love that constraint, because I think in that constraint, same with poetry, the more that it's constrained, the more creativity and the more real intellectual work can happen. So those are things that I think the academy does well, and that I do miss.
Yeah, and I think my interest changed a lot after I left the academy. So the kinds of stuff I read nowadays are very different. So, for instance, one of the things I'm trying to do is finally try to understand Marxism. I've never really did like a serious study of this stuff. You might have a thing or two to say, but like I I don't have anyone who is like an authority who I could go to and say, "This is what I think this means. Could you tell me what error I'm making?"
Don't go to
Yeah,
any Marxists.
yeah.
It'll,
This is
they'll just
also
tell
one of
you
the
what.
problems. Oh god, this is one of the problems actually with trying to learn about Marxism because there are so many like someone was like, "Well, do you mean like Kojève's interpretation of Marx or like this?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I just wanted to know what Marx meant by like fetishism. Like that was all I
Yeah.
wanted to know. You know, that's such a dense and knotty field where teams have formed in a weird way. So maybe that's
Religions
a
have
hard.
formed,
Yeah.
basically. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Effectively.
It's like talking to churches that have schismed
Right.
over
Always.
over fundamental questions or something. But I just don't have like those kinds of resources available to me that really only come from just being embedded in a community of scholarship.
Mhm.
And the amount that you learn by osmosis when you're around people like that uh, is pretty astounding. Actually, there's stuff I
Yeah.
never worked on, barely wrote about, that I knew at least at one point fairly competently, just because I talked through my friends' papers enough, and so I had to kind of get the lay of the land. I would never write something based on that or call myself an expert, but I learned a lot still.
Right. Yeah. And just also like conversations in hallways, conversations at the pub. You know, the fact that it's just you're awash in it. There's no way
Yeah.
out. It's like it's an ever present part of your life. And
My
so.
roommates were philosophers.
Mhm.
I commuted with philosophers. I was in I our grad department had graduate students were three to four grads in a small office each, just desks crammed together, and with a hallway full of graduate students. So if you wanted to ask someone a question, there were guys who were better than logic than me. I just went across the hall, went to their whiteboard, started writing.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
um, and you
Yeah.
you just don't have that if you're teaching yourself. You
Right.
just don't.
Yep. 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 And again, what's I think a real pity is that there's no version of that that's not the academy. And this is a thing that I'm curious. This is a much bigger question of what does it look like if, insofar as it's possible to reproduce something like that. Like whatever we work and stuff. What with whatever, but like what does it look like to have kind of an agora, a collective intellectual commons in the world where this kind of thing is cultivatable outside of the academy? That's a bigger question, and something I'm curious to think through folks like you with. But we left, right? We
Yeah.
left. We ultimately did leave, and I think we have lots of good reasons for leaving. And I think that the term failed academic, it gets thrown around in some ways, and I think there's two ways of looking at that. One way of looking at that is that you people do fail out of graduate school, and that's not what we're
Mhm.
talking about. I think another way of it is we didn't get a job. That's one
Hmm.
way of putting it. The other way of putting it is we didn't even try to get a job because
Hmm.
we walked away from that trajectory. And if I'm remembering correctly, you and I are in the same camp. We in some sense walked away.
Hmm.
We were like we weren't going on the job market. We weren't trying to do that at some level. We had something very different in mind for what do we wanted to do intellectually, and so maybe talk a little bit about sort of how you ended up leaving that trajectory and why you did and what that meant for you and
Yeah.
yeah,
So
what did that look like?
yeah, when I was getting near the end, um, I started to just honestly think about my job prospects. I don't think that people who are outside of the academic world understand how bleak it is out there right now for people to get academic jobs, especially in the humanities. Tenure tenure track faculty are not retiring, so that's one small contribution. Budgets continuously get cut, so they're even if they did retire, they wouldn't necessarily be replaced with other full time faculty. You're more and more doing postdocs if you're lucky, but so many people I knew who had very similar profiles to me, like research interest, level of publications, similar kinds of letters they could receive, were just becoming adjuncts. And they were actually making less money than they did when they were graduate students. Um, and I I had to just ask myself, like, is that a life that I am willing to endure for the potential of eventually getting a tenure track job? And but you have to be just honest about, like, how big's that potential? Like, actually, do you think you're going to get it? And I just thought, maybe at best it was a 50-50 coin toss for me. At best. How many years of this would I endure for a 50-50 coin toss? And eventually I just said, you know what? I just don't have to endure it. I could just go do other things. Um, so I did make the decision to just walk away. I had kind of an easier time because I had done enough logic that I actually went and worked at an AI company like right away. And in fact, I had a job 8 months before I defended, like just lined up. That's a better situation than most people had. But but I've seen other people in my department or in other departments here who were really good at philosophy, who also made the same decision. And I think that's just because you have to you just have to be honest about it. I mean, that's the purely kind of economic argument, right? The second kind of argument you can ask though is, would the kind of work that I want to do be supported in an academic environment? And I wasn't sure if that was true anymore for me when I was thinking about it. Now, it took me a little bit of time to figure out what I wanted to do philosophically after leaving. In fact, I probably went through like a year or so where I was like, kind of screw philosophy. I just work in tech now or something. Obviously, that didn't last. I eventually wanted to talk about it so badly that I got on the internet and turned a camera on. But I, um, I don't think I could talk about the kinds of things that I talk about or pursue a wide variety of interests like I pursue currently in the academy, because I would be constantly wanting to publish papers. And the way to make sure that you can publish more often is to go narrower and narrower. And while there are benefits to that, it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. And I was actually like a little sad by the fact that, I went to a analytic department. I went to a department which was heavily logic focused, very much like in the Anglo or Anglophone world. Um, and I basically didn't know that much about Heidegger. I didn't know that much about Hegel. I didn't know that much about, all of the, or, still to this day, I would say the ones I know the least about are probably a lot of phenomenologists. I never took a class on the existentialist. There were just all of these areas that I had just never even touched in philosophy. And I realized I was probably never going to touch them because I knew people who were in their 60s or 70s, had been academics their entire lives, and never touched these thinkers. And it was as if entire eras of history didn't even exist for them. And that just wasn't what I wanted for myself. So if I wanted to do the kind of stuff that I do now, I think I just had to leave. Did you have a similar kind of thought process, or?
A little differently. My experience in the last couple of years of graduate school were just terrible, just absolutely terrible. Totally unsupportive department. Just getting projects shot down. I was wanting to work on stuff, and no one would support what I was doing. It just was like it was the exact opposite of what I experienced when I was studying in Europe, where I was getting massive amounts of support, just like people really working with me. It was an amazing experience I had at the University of Amsterdam. Uh, Things just deteriorated in a way when I was in the PhD program in philosophy, and even the when I was going to conferences and stuff, I found the tenor and the way that philosophy was being done in Anglophone American conferences just to be toxic and hostile, not collegial, not curious, but like all this like punching up. Like if someone gave a talk and I could find one thing wrong with their answer and I could just really drag their argument, then I could get social cred and be the guy that said that thing to Habermas or whatever. And it was a bunch of like, and Nietzschean resenting, people like trying to flex through resent,
Mhm.
none of which were getting jobs, none of which like,
Yeah.
and it was just like a culture. I was like, this is just bad.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
just like a bunch of like beta bullies, picking who's, vultures, circling.
I
It
was,
was
by the way, I was totally one of these guys. I was so aggressive in talks. And I would be like, no, this is how we get our best ideas. And I would like always justify it. I look back and I'm just like totally mortified by my behavior. But exactly, I was like, my pen was out. I would write down, I would try to put them into primacy and conclusion form so I could just tell them
just
like,
formalize it.
did you know your whole talk rested on a really simple fallacy? And I
Yeah.
wanted that gotcha. I even remember once I I asked a really great question to a scholar who was coming to give a talk at our department that kind of stumped him for a bit. And he eventually came back. And the level of approval I got from certain colleagues and professors was insane. Just like they were like, you almost
It gets
got him.
rewarded.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
again, I'm not saying that there's not a place to like take apart arguments and like, you know, yeah, there's a place for that. I'm not
yeah,
opposed to that kind. I'm not opposed to something like that. But when it's part of a toxic culture of hazing and bullying, which I do think
yeah,
it is largely
yeah,
a
yeah.
culture of hazing and bullying, like those are the people that killed Socrates. Those are not the people that were him. I just didn't like, and I sound so naive to say things
Mm.
like that, but like I came into philosophy having like learned about Bruno being burned alive and Socrates. Like it was a world
Yeah.
for me of like a culture of learning, a culture of debating too, and not to at all rule that out. But anyway, I'll close this by saying by the end of my program, it got to the point where my advisor was like, "You don't want to be here, and I don't think they want you here. Like, write something and go.
Yeah.
Just get out. Like, this isn't like pull the band-aid off, man. Just like get out." And yeah, so I wrote like literally what was the dissertation I could pull out of my ass the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
fastest, and I wrote a dissertation in 6 months, like,
Oh, okay. Wow. Wow. Yeah.
and I was like, and defended, wrote it and defended 6 months, and I was like, I'm out. And still an interesting dissertation. It was on Marx's metaethics, which interestingly enough, no one had ever written on. There
I looked
has
at the
never.
abstract of your dissertation. I wish I had seen that exact phrase. I feel like I would have latched on a little harder. I don't know if
Yeah,
I saw it, but that's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
yeah, it's Marx's metaethics, and it's a funny thing because Marx gets kind of kettled to the continental folks. There's some analytics in Britain that do it, but it was taking again. It was what Memphis does well. It's sort of analytic approaches continental stuff in a way. But at any rate, when I was done, I don't think I read philosophy for a year after I was
Yeah.
done with the
Yeah.
dissertation. It was like a hangover.
Yeah.
And when I came back from it, I was like, okay, maybe in a similar to you, I was like, okay, I'm still committed to this. This is still a vocation, and
Yeah.
like the almost the religious sense of that word.
Hmm.
This is a vocation. I'm never going to give this up. I'm never going to be away from this. I love this, so I want to find the way to fall back in love with it.
Yeah.
And I found a way to fall back in love with doing and studying and reading philosophy. So
Now,
yeah,
do you think if you had stayed in some hypothetical world, do you think you would be able to research the topics that you currently research for your channel? Yeah.
No, I'll give you one example. I was in a Descartes seminar, and I knew going into the Descartes seminar what I wanted to write my paper on, and that was this mystical vision that Descartes had in the heated room, and really go into like what was Descartes reading, and what was going on in the intellectual world in which that kind of mystical dream could happen, and then what traces of that dream survive in rationalism.
Yeah.
And it's a mystical dream of a divine being giving Descartes basically the meditations at some level. And the meditations
Yeah.
are structured like a religious experience. They're meditating, they're meditationes, they're religious meditations that you even break for on the Sabbath. It's a religious undergoing at some level for Descartes. And I pitched the idea at like 2 weeks into the seminar. I pitched the idea to the teacher. Immediately was told, do not write on that. And if you write on that, I will like, you cannot present on that, definitely. And if you write on that, I'll have to return the paper.
Wow. Yeah.
Like,
you're making me realize also, one, that Descartes, there's like some structural similarities between like Descartes and Boethius. Sort of down on your luck.
Yep.
At your lowest.
In a real crisis.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting point. But yeah, I think that there is a kind of sense of you need to kind of play within the lines in your field, right? And then if you're interested in a field like you are, which is a field that does not have its own department usually. Well, there is no esoteric studies department as far as I know.
There are 3 of them.
Okay.
In the entire world.
And maybe there's like 2 journals that they all publish in or something. It's going to be fairly small. And so if you're in a philosophy department, they're not going to want you to publish in those. Yeah. They're not going to want you to present at those. They're going to want you to figure out what can be published at, Mind or whatever the big philosophy journals are. Exactly. Yeah. And so if you're interested in interesting syntheses or just topics that don't fit neatly into a disciplinary boundary, then you're kind of doomed.
Yeah. And again, this is the thing that is, I think, bad about academic philosophy is that it's fossilized. Like, there's no way to like do this interdisciplinary work, although they'll talk a big game about interdisciplinary stuff. And there is some cool stuff going in cognitive science and philosophy and phenomenology that it is happening. But those
I had a
are
linguist. I had a linguist on my dissertation committee.
Yeah. It is happening.
I was doing semantics, and so it was like I kind of fit between.
Yep. So again, folks, try to hear us saying 2 things, right? Academic philosophy has problems. Also, at the same time, autodidactism also has problems. And again, I'll come back to this, Jared, again. One of the ways I want to square the circles, I really do want to think through, like, what do communities of wonder look like outside of the academy? I mean, that's definitely a conversation for another day. Yeah. But and what do the grants look like to do that? Which is really the question. So then, speaking of grants, another thing that's also dominating academic philosophy is like the jockeying toward grant money, and for me, frankly, the politics that are adjacent to most grant money is like really like the political money and the DoD money, like that. Some of that money is like really nasty Koch brothers money.
I actually was paid partly by a project that I really liked being a part of on public discourse when I was at the University of Connecticut, but it was paid by the Templeton Foundation. I personally don't have any problems taking money from the Templeton Foundation, at least for this kind of work. But I knew other people who were like really against it, and they had like principled objections, So, but like I would feel much stronger about taking like DoD grants or something.
Yeah, and mostly philosophers don't get those. But again, this cognitive science astronaut stuff that's going on.
You know who got a ton of DoD grants back in the day?
Who?
Early linguists in semantics and syntax.
I can imagine. It's like
because they basically promised the Navy that they could have a universal translator in 10 years if you gave them enough money.
It's a good hustle.
man, it paid for a lot of semantics PhDs.
I can bet it did.
I can bet it so many. It's so funny to look back at like these classic 70s semantics papers, because all of them in the acknowledgments are like, I think Noam Chomsky and Jerry Fodor and all of the people at MIT and also the Department of Defense.
Yeah. Yeah, the way that money trickles into the philosophy or departments in general, but philosophy departments, humanities departments is hilarious. Let's get a bit more practical, Jared. Most folks here, I think, are watching are not academics. They don't want to be academics, and God bless them. But what are some tips that and one thing I really like about your channel is that you give really great advice. Like I've watched some of your content, and I'm like, just not only is you doing smart content, but also you're like really doing the work of like sort of meta philosophy, like meta academics, meta study. Like, these are the kind of foundational things that make people good at studying in general, reading in general, which, we're not born to read. Reading is a very strange, unusual thing, and reading cultures have evolved over time. But I'm curious, what are some of our tips for non-academics reading philosophy? What would be, I know, top 3, top 2,
Yeah.
any stuff like that?
Okay, so I've got a couple off the top of my head. So the first one is this: accept that it's going to be really hard, and that the books are going to be hard to understand, and that's fine. That should not keep you from reading them. I hear so many people say, I'm not ready to read Plato. I need an introductory work to help me read Plato first. That's BS. You should read Plato. If you want to read Plato, you should go and read Plato. You will not understand Plato all the way, because people who have studied Plato for their entire lives don't understand Plato. So you are now on the same footing as the greatest classic scholars of the last 100 years. All right. So welcome to the club. But you should just be okay with this. We have this weird knowledge culture, which thinks that what it is that books are places where you extract information and then you can just get rid of them. And that the goal of a reader is to extract all the good information and then to have mastered the subject, and then you can move on. These are texts from which you will never move on.
Right.
And so they are hard, and be okay with needing to reread them and all of this, but just accept it and tell yourself that's okay. Every single philosopher every single smart person who knows a lot about some philosopher had to read them as a complete beginner, and they didn't understand what they were talking about. And so just be okay with that. I that's like the single biggest hurdle that I think I encounter when people ask me about stuff like, what should I do to read these things? Just be okay with it. The second thing, though, that I want to advise is to avoid a kind of intellectual vice, which is to assume that you have caught these sort of great minds of history, or other people in general, but let's just restrict ourselves to the great minds who wrote these great works, as if they made obvious mistakes. It's a really lazy habit, but it's a way that a lot of people, when they read these, will read. Let's say I was just doing anything on the meditation, so let's talk about the meditation. The meditation is not the most sophisticated philosophical work out there. It's got its flaws. There are a couple of times where, if you were reading it like a modern philosopher, you would say Marcus Aurelius just straightforwardly commits the fallacy of composition, where he's or sort of the reverse of the fallacy here, where the fallacy of division. If it's good for the whole, then it's good for the parts, is the kind of inference he's okay making. If you understand Stoic metaphysics, that's an inference that's actually okay to make.
Right. Yeah.
But if you didn't take the time to think about the Stoic metaphysics in the background that Marcus Aurelius does not make explicit, you would think he just committed an obvious logical fallacy. And you would have learned your list of logical fallacies. You might have learned it from me. I'm sorry. And then you've now dismissed this book, and you haven't asked the more interesting questions. So I had a professor who taught me Aristotle told me, when we were reading the Nicomachean Ethics, the beginning of the seminar, he said, for the next 12 weeks, Aristotle is correct. And that was a really powerful lesson, actually, because we spent 12 weeks trying to figure out the workings of the Aristotelian mind.
Yeah, I call it the sympathetic reading, like the principle of charity. Always have the principle of charity,
which is the exact opposite way that people are being taught to read now.
Yeah,
I think they are being taught to be paranoid and critical readers. Being a critical reader is good, but what they think that means is like, I can spot one flaw and now I can throw the whole thing out.
Right. As if it's just one Zhang deduction or something.
Yeah, exactly. So be okay reading the hard books. Know that you're not going to understand them. Don't think that you've caught them in obvious mistakes. That's the I think, yeah, probably those are the first two big ones,
Mm.
because that's going to help you avoid a lot of those oversimplifications as you're becoming an autodidact.
Yeah, I think those are fantastic. And the principle of charity, I think, is absolutely like it's the Dunning-Kruger effect. The people who begin to read philosophy think they already know a lot about philosophy, and therefore they just like, oh, I understand Heidegger. Heidegger got this wrong.
Yeah.
Like, the hammer hammering. He's just the course is still there.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous to think the hammer disappeared. I'm like, that's not what he's talking about.
Yes.
um,
And a sort of corollary of this is to think that you can get a sense of a few thinkers and then dismiss an entire tradition.
yeah,
Oh, I found Heidegger saying something stupid, so phenomenology is dumb,
yeah,
or all of continental philosophy is dumb.
right.
Never mind the fact that Husserl is arguably a founder of both continental and analytic philosophy.
And certainly,
Yeah.
Brentano and Twardowski definitely were.
Yes. Yeah.
They're
Right.
at
And
the very core of where analytic philosophy goes.
you could look at a period of history where you could read a passage and not know if Frege or Husserl wrote it.
Right. Absolutely.
It's not a long period of history, but that period exists. And I
Mhm.
find people, maybe it's this tendency, people want to kind of join intellectual teams.
Right. It's
So
tribalism.
like, well, I'm a Stoic, so I know the Epicureans are wrong. I'm a Stoic, so I know the Peripatetics are wrong. BS, you don't know that. Like
Yeah.
you don't know that.
And also, like, it's as if Stoicism was coherent over the course of the Stoa. Like,
Yeah.
Posidonius is very different than Marcus Aurelius. Like, yeah, it's a bizarre. Yeah, it's this sort of tribalism team. I need to join my religion. Like, my religion is the right religion, and your religion is the wrong religion. And I've learned that from our religious culture, and therefore I had to apply it to my philosophy game. Yeah, I think those are all great points, and I think that I agree with you. Again, I would say also the principle of charity is a big one of mine.
Mhm.
Read assuming who you're reading is right until you get to the end, and then wait a few years, and then you could begin the task of breaking them down. And again, I love the idea of like paranoid reading.
Mhm.
This sort of idea that, like, again, it's this punching up culture, right? Like, in order for me to read, he must be wrong,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is I think a very toxic kind of intellectual way of being in the world. Um, I guess the other thing is, and it's to your point, right? Aristotle said that philosophy begins in wonder, and I think you can translate that same word as bewilderment. And
Mhm.
I do think that when you get into like questions of fundamental ethics, fundamental ontology, if you're not bewildered, like, and I mean that like in a really existential way, emotionally bewildered, values bewildered, bewildered in a very deep way, then you're probably doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Especially if you think you've got it figured out, and now you're, the more that I feel like you're bewildered through the process, that I think the more authentic
Yeah.
you're doing philosophy. And Aristotle, I think, to me, when he says philosophy begins in bewilderment, I think that's true. And I think that the experience of being bewildered is a pretty good indicator that you're doing it.
Yeah.
Um,
I used to tell people that like my biggest sort of academic superpower was that when I didn't understand something, I would get angry. Not like at the person or something, but I felt this sense of like the world is not right.
yeah.
And this is maybe a slightly more hostile version of bewilderment, but I had to work out some problems.
Hey,
But
yeah, I remember the first time I read the first critique by Kant, I threw it across the room and I put a hole in our sheetrock, and which is testimony to Kant,
yeah,
that it could, but my dad made me fix the hole, and he was like, next time you throw a book, I want to have I need a good reason why you threw it.
yeah,
And the only reason I give, I didn't understand what the hell he's talking about.
yeah,
It's not a very good reason to throw a book. It's me that needs to be thrown out the book.
yeah.
And so yeah, I think cultivating bewilderment is a good thing. And also, I guess the last one I would say is, thread the argument. And this is where my more analytic training comes in, is that there really is a way that many philosophers are able to masquerade, um, masquerade wisdom, or masquerade nonsense as wisdom, basically, by
Yeah,
and um, and this is a sort of the inverse of the first, right? This is the inverse of sympathetic reading. Look, man, like, logic's a hell of a thing formalizations of a thing. I mean, for my episode on Parmenides, I formalized Parmenides' way of truth. And it's not because I have a beef with Parmenides. And I do think the formalization does show those problems, or at least it
Mhm.
leads to modal collapse if you think modal collapse is a problem. And get good logic.
Yeah.
If you can get good logic, get good at formalizing, get good at, seeing what the argument actually is. I do think, and again, I came from also a continental background where I do think a lot of it was just nonsense. It was just, nonsense. And I do think a lot of people wasted their lives trying to decode what was either very obvious stuff, like don't
Mhm.
be mean,
Yeah.
like sort of Levinas, like other people are people, don't be mean to them, like, like, or it was actually just straight up nonsense. It was just gibberish.
Yeah.
And I think that any argument that is so resistant to formalization as to be uh, immune to formalization
Mhm.
is probably doing something other than philosophy. It might
Yeah.
be doing poetry, it might be doing religion, it might be doing mysticism, and those are all really important things. But it's really important to be able to divide a line and say, if this is so resistant to formalization that it's impenetrable to formalization, then I need to be able to know that on the front end, so to know that what I'm dealing with is not actually an argument.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's something else.
I think going along with formalization, just looking closely at terms and asking yourself, what does this mean?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's going to be about fairly obvious terms. I had a professor in grad school. He's actually my wife's dissertation advisor. And so he was a great guy to read my papers occasionally. He's been much more thorough on her work because she reads every single draft, and he'll just go line by line and just like underline every word where he's like, I don't know what this word means here.
Mm.
Or I think I can come up with 3 different readings, and on 2 of them this argument is bad.
Right.
And just asking yourself that about your own thinking, for one. Are you actually fooling yourself?
Right.
Too, like that's are you using words that you don't understand because you want to sound smart, or they kind of sound like they should be true if you put them in the right order? But also just knowing that sometimes some philosophers, they do, we generally want to be charitable there, but like I think what you said here is it should also withstand scrutiny of asking
Mhm.
formalization and asking to disambiguate, as we
Right.
analytic philosophers love to talk about. uh, you should be able to really ask those questions. And if people say that the only way to understand what Hegel means by this particular term, or like what Freud means by sublimation, is to just like read all of Freud or all of Hegel to get it, that is them being dishonest.
Yeah.
Either there's
Or that
nothing there, or
it's
they don't know what
religion.
they're talking about. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Or it's mysticism. It's actually
yeah,
mysticism. And I do think like Hegel I think I think Hegel crosses into something mystical. I think later Heidegger does too.
yeah.
So
I was reading Karl Marx's biography, a biography of Marx that I've been really enjoying. And when he discovered Hegel, he writes these like ecstatic letters to his
yeah.
father. And he's like, I have seen the world has been revealed to me. It reads like Julian of Norwich or something.
Oh yeah. No,
Yeah,
the early Marx is it's such a yeah. I can say lots about the early Marx.
yeah, yeah.
um, um, yeah, and again, so going to Hegel, right? It's dialectic, right? Like principle of charity, principle of scrutiny.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
and be rigorous, about both. And I would say I would begin with the principle of charity and then
Yes.
end with the principle of scrutiny.
Yeah. Yeah.
That would be my my advice. Pitfalls. What are some pitfalls when it comes to you know? And maybe let's keep it to reading, right? Just like
Hmm.
maybe reading a text, because philosophy largely begins in reading, but also we can talk about communicating philosophy. I'll give one example that I loved is that a professor I had said, basically, if you can't explain a philosophical idea from one bus stop to another, you probably don't understand it.
Hmm.
Have you seen these videos where a physics professor will start with like a child and then like a
Oh
high
yeah. Yeah.
schooler
Yeah.
and then a grad like a
It's
college
such a
grad?
it's such a good concept. It's such a good concept.
We need that for philosophy.
Yeah.
Like, like take whatever apatheia and go from elementary school to like post grad, and
Yeah.
like, can you explain apatheia at every level?
Yeah.
And I for me, I love the bus stop analogy because
Mhm.
it means that you don't know who's getting on the bus.
No, yeah, yeah.
So you have to be able to like, oh, you're wearing a tweed suit. It might be the case that I need to talk in Greek to you,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
or whatever. But I love the idea that like out of the gate, how high and how low can you go, and you should be able to do it at every register. And at some level, if you can't talk about the face of the other and Levinas to like a you know to a working class pipe fitter, I don't know that you know what you're talking about, or
Yeah,
rather,
yeah.
I don't know that Levinas was talking about anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
More to the point, but pitfalls, right? Like, but pitfalls. The idea that you can't explain this to normal people, common people,
Mhm.
regular people. I think to me, that's a red flag
Yeah.
instantly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but um,
And
but
this
what
is
are the
pitfalls of being an autodidact or,
pitfalls?
you know.
Are pitfalls of like autodidact, or even also pitfalls of academics? Like, what are the kind of things that like what are the kinds of things that you've experienced or you've seen that like these are things that people really
Yeah.
really get they really that really muck up their ability to either read philosophy or even live philosophically. And I
Oh,
think
yeah, yeah.
those are very different things, but related.
Yeah. I think though the biggest trouble you're going to face is a kind of like unearned elitism, in the sense of I think here where I used to like almost make fun of the fact that my family wanted to know what my dissertation was about. And like how could they ever possibly understand it? And I realized that this was, for me, this was just a way of not having to think about how to explain it in simpler terms. This was
Mm,
not a way for me to put it. I was failing at those lower registers. I could explain at a very high register using a lot of jargon, but I wasn't thinking about through this. So I think had kind of imbibed this. And the fact is, I was being an elitist, but I hadn't even earned the right to be an elitist, if you can ever earn the right to be one, because I couldn't actually do the thing. Um, I mean, that's a huge part of it. But I think what can happen is, well, something that I have seen over and over again, both from professional philosophers and autodidacts, is that they become pretty good at like one area of philosophy
mhm.
or like one area of knowledge, and they think that that means they can speak as confidently about other areas
Right.
without putting in the same amount of care.
Hmm.
It's as if like they've like I'm Dr. Jared Henderson, so therefore I can pontificate about X, Y, and Z. So that's why I tell people, like, if they ask me questions about Stoicism, I am an interested reader of Stoicism. My PhD is not in ancient Greek philosophy. I've never published on ancient Greek philosophy. I do this stuff because I can read scholarly work and try to synthesize it for a
Right.
larger audience. That's what I'm doing here. If you wanted me to talk like an expert, it would be about semantics, and it would be about logic, and it would be about theories of truth, particularly in the Anglophone tradition or something. But you have to, whenever you expertise isn't transferable between subject matters,
Right.
or
Yep.
even competency isn't, right? So if you're an autodidact and you've read a lot of Nietzsche and you kind of get Nietzsche, now you can't just glance at Plato and act like you know what he's all about. You have to do the same amount of work that you did for Nietzsche, but you have to do it for Plato now. You start from scratch every time.
Right. And
You're
on Plato's
you,
own terms, not reading it
yes,
through the Nietzschean hermeneutic that you now have no doubt developed.
yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Where it's that's the problem with autodidacts often is they'll get good at the one thing and then read everything. You know, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yes.
Um,
So as a Nietzschean, I have this view of Plato.
yeah.
As a Nietzschean, I have this view of analytic philosophers or something. Yeah, I think that is a really nice point. And it can even happen sometimes with things that you've actually been taught. There's this great example from the history of analytic philosophy, which is a G.E. Moore paper called A Refutation of Idealism, which almost shows like a stunning lack of familiarity with
Right.
idealism. And yet all of his professors would have been idealists, because British
That's true.
idealism at the time was actually still the dominant way of thinking.
Right.
British idealism at one point was a very robust area of philosophy. There's like one scholarly book about this.
No. Right.
Um,
Or
and
I mean, it's amazing how long actually like the Cambridge Platonists and other
mhm,
like not just like idealism, but like highfalutin mysticism at some level
yeah, yeah,
was the dominant Anglophone tradition for a couple hundred years, and no one talks about that.
yeah. And I had this kind of wake up call where after I wrote my dissertation, and in part of my dissertation, I ended up defending this idea that truth comes in degrees, which I think is a very common sense idea, but most analytic philosophers reject it. So I try to give very analytic arguments for why that is. I think I actually accidentally parroted some arguments from F.H. Bradley,
Hmm.
who I had never read, because he was one of the idealists that G.E. Moore told us was worthless.
Right.
And it was like, oh, okay, maybe I actually should have known, because I started thinking about, like, if truth comes in degrees, what does this mean for knowledge? And I had this like weird view about, like, well, true knowledge is only like comprehension of like the whole of the truth. And then I was like, wait, something has gone really wrong, because I'm talking about like comprehending whole systems and like the whole world. And that's when someone keyed me off that maybe I was accidentally reinventing idealism, but in much cruder terms.
If you say you're
Uh,
like accidentally a Hegelian or something,
exactly. I was
like,
like,
hold
oh
on,
man,
you're
maybe
talking
I should have actually read them. Maybe I should have really read them. Yeah.
yeah. I think one of my pitfalls is sort of also related to this, um, is that philosophy follows fashions.
Mm.
That philosophy is very fashion conscious, and philosophical fashions come and go, especially in the continental world. But this is also true in the analytic world, as much as analytic people may resist it. And that those fashions are not indicative of anything true or anything good.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
I'll give one example of this. So when I was in graduate school, the all the big stuff was to read what all these 1960s French people and Deleuze and Derrida and all this shit,
Mm-hmm.
and it was all not Hegel or bust, because Hegel is all about the absolute and the totality, and we are about difference and micro stuff, Foucault
Mm-hmm.
micro things. And it was like, we're going to read Deleuze and he's going to take apart Lacan and blah blah blah. It was all this sort of like, and I came into this and I was like, and this is me coming into it as a Marxist, and I'm like, they're fighting fights that one French people aren't fighting anymore.
Mm-hmm.
The French aren't doing that philosophy anymore. They're fighting fights that were localized around structuralism, which, like, there aren't structuralists left. Turns out I'm
Yeah.
actually a structuralist. Um, and 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 everyone's reading this because a bunch of fancy people in the 1990s were reading it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, this is fashion.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
we're reading this book for the same reason that someone might wear a Chanel thing.
Yeah.
It's not because we think Chanel is great. It's because someone a generation ago thought they were great. And
Yeah.
we were inheriting these fights that not even French people are fighting anymore.
Yeah.
Logical positivism, huge it was a big fashion thing, and it was like super smart, and it didn't. And so much of what I worry about is fashion in philosophy, and
Mm-hmm.
and I don't trust fashion. Like, I think that there's something. I prefer the naivety of, like, Socrates.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm going to go where the truth goes. Like, I'm going to see where I'm intellectually interested, and I'm going to see what problems are intellectually interesting to me, and I'm going to try to work on that. This is why I love Leibniz. Leibniz's philosophy is the least systematic philosophy of all time. It's literally just people writing to him going like, how do you think degrees work? How do you think this works? And he just,
Yeah.
like, wrote them letters back. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and the monadology is just sort of like one tiny little thing, but really Heidegger, like, I was like, say Heidegger, but like, Leibniz was driven by problems.
Mm-hmm.
And I love, like, one of my favorite works by Aristotle, which is probably not by him, is like the Problems, which is a
Mm-hmm.
long list of things that he didn't understand.
Oh, that's cool. I haven't read that, but yeah.
He probably didn't write it, but
Yeah.
it's one of his students probably. But I
Yeah.
love the idea that, like, we should be working on problems, not following fads, not following
Yeah.
fashion.
Yeah.
And if
Though I
there's
would say
yeah,
the
go ahead.
problems also, so in the analytic world, we often fashion ourselves as like problem solvers. We
Right.
find puzzles and we try to
The,
solve
the
them.
problems are also fads.
The
Yeah.
puzzles can become fads.
Mhm.
I was around for the time of grounding, when grounding was the thing,
Yep.
right? And you would find the logic of ground, on what grounds what. There's this great paper though that was published, which I actually think is supposed to be very interesting, but it's like, does the grounding's partial ground of the ground partly ground the grounded?
You're like reading Meister Eckhart all of a sudden.
Exactly. And you're like, we used to make fun of Heidegger for the nothing knots, and then
Yeah.
we wrote that sentence.
The
Apparently the
grounding
paper's good.
grounds.
So, but But that was totally a fad. That was
Yeah.
totally, I think, a fashion. And it's actually very funny for two YouTubers to be talking about. Because like the criticism of the kind of work we do now is that we're always having to chase algorithmic trends. I don't think either of us really chase those too hard because we're kind of, you know, just talking about what we want to talk about. But it's funny to have the conversation on YouTube to talk
Yeah.
about the fads
Man,
here.
look, I wish there were algorithmic trends for the stuff I work on.
Yeah.
Like I'm doing an episode on the Aramaic incantation bowls from the 5th to the 8th centuries. I wish there were the algorithm for me to ride on that one.
Yeah. You couldn't even like I feel like if like a good horror show came out on like Netflix or something, you could do like a esoterica expert fact checks, but it would be
you
so
you
I don't know. I would feel if you did it, I would support you, but I think it would be lame.
yeah so I never yeah so this is funny what's funny what you say is I'm actually trying to fix the problem so that I can do that, which is
Oh,
to
okay.
say
Yeah.
that writers in Hollywood are so disconnected from the actual historical magic and esotericism that nothing on screen resembles anything from the past. And so actually
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
so what I'm trying to do is two things at once. I'm trying to get into Hollywood so I can do consulting for movies to make money. And then
Okay.
also like, when they muck it up, I can do like, reviews of their movies. It's a joke, but it's a very serious joke.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. That
But
yeah.
yeah. um, Jared, what are some texts that if someone wants to get into philosophy, let's say someone's like autodidact or someone's just like, coming out, someone's like smart at math. They're smart at like coming out from STEM. They're
Mhm.
coming at this from a non-philosophy background. They're coming at it from a religious background,
Mhm.
right? But they just want to like pick up 2 or 3 foundational books of philosophy. What would you put in their hand? I kind of have an idea what I will put in their hand, but what would you
Yeah,
put in their hand?
the first thing I'm doing is getting this really slim Hackett volume that I recommend to everybody over and over again. That's called Plato's Five Dialogues. This
Mm,
is a bit of an artificial grouping because Plato did not group them as five dialogues, but they are
right.
thematically linked enough that it makes sense. Basically, you will learn about the last days of Socrates, and you will get also probably my favorite beginner dialogue ever is the Euthyphro because it just gives you this clear problem that you can then get students to talk about for hours if you present it
Mm,
correctly. So and that's a topic people love to talk about. It's like what is good, but also what's the relationship between goodness and God. People
right.
just get excited about that. But I think the Apology is a genuinely stirring read, and as
And funny.
is, yes, yes,
Yeah,
and as
it's
is
funny.
Phaedo,
Yeah.
as is Crito. I mean the whole thing, and I think Meno is also one of there,
Mhm.
and that every dialogue in that collection is great. You will learn about a different subject each time, but they're speaking to what I would very loosely almost call those existential concerns that
Mhm.
someone interested in philosophy is there, which is God, goodness, death, knowledge, standing up for what you believe in, loyalty, these kind of deep themes that you think you're going to get to talk about if you go and study philosophy. So that's the first thing I put in anybody's hands. Because especially if they don't especially if they tell me that they don't know what they're interested in yet, they just think they
Mhm.
want to do philosophy. The other one is probably Descartes' Meditations,
Yeah,
so that you
hard
can
agree.
see
That's a good one of mine.
yeah, so you can see a philosopher think systematically
Yep.
about a number of issues, building it from the ground up. It's helpful to read a foundationalist for this.
Mhm.
Um, it's also a good read. It's just fun. These are both
Yeah.
texts that I had fun teaching to students.
Yep.
And then my third recommendation is just one single chapter from one book. You don't need to read the rest of the book because the rest of the book's not actually amazing. You could do it if you want, and that's the last chapter of Bertrand Russell's Problems of Philosophy,
Hmm.
which is about that book is so dry. I taught it once to undergrads and it was a huge mistake, I think, teaching it because they were so uninterested in structured propositions and talking about Desdemona loves Cassio is different than Cassio loves Desdemona and things. But man, you read that last chapter and it's suddenly about it's actually I guess you might think that it's Bertrand Russell echoing Aristotle.
Mhm.
That
Mhm.
philosophy actually is going to lead you to appreciate the universe in a new way and is going to you will look at the familiar as if it is extraordinary. And I want to say this is the kind of view of philosophy that you should never lose.
Yeah. Yep.
Never, never, never move past that. If you've moved past it, you've become a cynic, and I don't mean the philosophically respectable kind of cynic.
Yeah. Yeah, those are great. Also, thumbs up to Hackett. Employee owned, uh, such reasonable prices. You can get them used for pennies.
And
Uh,
quality translations.
quality
The
translations,
yeah,
quality introductions.
yeah.
The introduction to their version of the Parmenides by Plato is like just amazing. It's worth.
I've got one my guy in my Discord who just occasionally just posts book hauls, and it's always just he ordered straight from Hackett.
Yeah,
And he's like, I spent $40 and I got 7 books,
yeah,
and
yeah.
and they're
Hackett
all
is like the
they're all great.
folks. Hackett is the anti Brill. Like as much as I hate on Brill, Hackett is like the Christ of publishing in
Yeah.
terms of academic rigor, and it's such a like they're decent people. They publish good stuff, good translations, rigorous and inexpensive, employee owned, which
Yeah.
means that like the employees are actually making a decent wage. Also, they pay their authors well. Yeah, um, always happy to recommend
Yeah,
a
I knew
Hackett
someone
collection.
who published a new translation of a bunch of Anselm's writings for Hackett. A lot of major publishers just wouldn't be interested in that, or if
Yep,
they were they would put it in a hardback and it would be $300 for the next 10 years.
yep,
And you could buy immediately this collected translations, all brand new of Anselm for $35, and that's expensive for a Hackett.
yeah, yeah,
But it was brand new, so you kind of understood, and it was thick.
yep. Let me put it in the chat so folks. Um, yeah. Yeah, go check out Hackett, folks. Great stuff. Totally agree with you about the meditations. Also, one thing I love about meditations too is that the meditations are they'll always show me my philosophers in the room because
Mm,
because the philosophers in the room will always get Descartes' circle immediately.
mm,
Like
yeah.
like I can teach an intro level philosophy class, and meditations will always be in there, and there'll be the 3 students out of 40 who go, hold on, no, no, no,
Yeah,
and I'm
yeah,
like,
yeah.
yep, there you go, you guys,
You
like,
guys should look at 201 or
yep,
105 or whatever the next class
like
is.
you
You
are the
you
ones, like
you might
yeah,
dig it. Yeah.
yep. Um, Also, I love the letter to Hobbes, back and forth
Oh
to
yeah,
Hobbes,
yeah.
yeah, where he
If
just
you're
writes
gonna
off Hobbes.
read Descartes, it's worth. I mean, you can just get the Hackett actually for the
Yep,
meditations, but if you could eventually get the correspondence,
yep. It's cool.
there's some really good stuff with Lady Elizabeth, for instance,
Yeah.
was the Princess of
The
Bohemia.
objection and replies
Yeah,
are
yeah,
everything should always have to have like you should have to have objection and replies. It's such a great genre of literature.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So yeah, the meditations I think is one of my first. Um, Plotinus's chapter on beauty is another one of mine,
Oh,
and
okay,
this
wow,
is
yeah.
leaning into my more esoteric crowd.
Hmm.
But the chapter on beauty captures that. You know, Plotinus is a terrible writer, but when you get him wound up, man, you know, even a wrong clock is right twice a day, and man, the Ennead 6 on beauty is just
I have
it,
I I have a
it's just
friend who is one such a big fan of you. He was like so excited that I was going to stream with you. He's not excited about my YouTube channel, but um, but he keeps asking me. He's like, "When are you going to do a video about Plotinus?"
oh,
Like, because
Plotinus such a
and I'm like, "Man, I'm never doing a video about Plotinus because I'd have to really grapple with Plotinus, and like, I got too many other things I got to read."
yeah, no, Plotinus is such a pain. I mean, amazing pain, but a pain. But the Ennead on beauty, you know, if
Yeah.
you have a weekend just to like to chop at that one, God, it's good. So I would say the Ennead on beauty is one that I come back to a lot. I think it's one of the more beautiful ones, and inspiring in the way that I think philosophy should be inspiring. Um, I think also one that I come back to, and it's a toss up. Either it's the Enchiridion of Epictetus, which I'm not like. Sometimes I come back to, and sometimes I don't. But I think the Consolation of Philosophy, Boethius,
Yeah.
is a
I love that
text
book.
that
Yeah.
I again, for its meditative quality, for like philosophy as a way of and I think coping is not the right word, but for engaging white knuckled reality. You're like,
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
right, this is not going to go anywhere. I am here and we are here and this is it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think Boethius is a text that inspires um what's the right word? it's inspirational, but also
Mhm.
inspires deep humility because Boethius is at his last. This is
Yeah.
the last. He's gonna die, and
Mhm.
like at that moment, the same reason for the Phaedo and those texts, right? The Crito. What does it look like to do philosophy at the end?
Yeah.
Because if we
And
if
he
we if
and he ends the text with Lady Philosophy exhorting him to go and do good.
yeah
What good is he going to do? He's in a cell, but
yeah
he's going to find a way to do good because
yeah
he knows it's coming.
it's coming.
You know, yeah,
And I
he
think
knows.
that like that's such an instructive thing for us for whom the end is not imminent,
Yeah,
that if in those last moments people could face the end with such philosophical awe and encouragement and beauty to do the good, you
yeah,
know, then we can take that inspiration and walk out the front door and be decent and be
yeah, yeah,
kind and be
yeah,
thoughtful. And so those are moments of extreme philosophical heroism for me.
yeah.
And so I think that we could all, yeah, we can all be informed by it. And I think Boethius is also beautiful. The Consolation Philosophy is a beautiful, thoughtful text. So,
Oh,
um,
it's gorgeous. I mean, the breaks in poetry, just
yeah,
kind of interspersed throughout. They're great. The imagery, it's got. I mean, it has so much literary value, but also
right,
being philosophically dense.
yep,
Yeah,
yep.
it's great.
It's a text I love to teach. I taught philosophy in prison once, and
Oh,
that was the
cool.
text we ended. That was the text we ended on.
Nice.
It was a really humbling experience to sit with incarcerated men and to say like, all right, like this man's incarcerated, he's on death row. You know, how does he relate to these questions? And we read Plato as well and Socrates, and it was a very humbling, powerful experience.
Because for him, the question is very real.
No, it's the most real.
It's not a hypothetical,
No,
right? You know,
it is like days away. Like
yeah.
it
I mean, the
is
truth is, it's real for us, and we like to pretend that it's a hypothetical.
right.
But for him, he can't delude himself, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I
I
think
might
that
I'm gonna die next week. What do I make of Boethius?
yeah, yeah. Boethius is powerful, powerful, powerful. Um, People talk a big game about desert island books, and I don't want to do that because I feel like that's sort of putting people on like, all right, what book would you take to a desert island forever? And
Yeah,
I'm like, no, no book, but
yeah,
summer book. I think like if you had to be a monk, and I think both of us with small children,
mhm,
we have big monk desires to like if we
yeah,
could just monk out, we would choose to if I could take them 3 months and just be a monk, and of course
mhm.
I wouldn't do that because I love my kids, but if we could, there's a part of us that wants to,
If I could
but
freeze them somehow,
yeah,
and so I could
yeah,
come
come
back. Yeah,
back and nothing would
yeah,
change. We freeze
yeah,
time and monk out. But if you could monk out 3 months, one season,
yeah,
um, you can pick the season and pick the book. Because I don't know about you, but I'm also a very seasonal philosopher. What I read in the summer, it's like drinking. I'm not going to
yeah,
drink Calvinist in the summer. Ugh.
yeah.
Like I'm gonna, but if we're gonna monk out, what would be your 3 month monk out
Yeah,
book?
yeah. I think one, it would be the winter because I read the most in the winter,
Okay.
and for some reason it just feels more like a monk if you're like in a cold cell.
Oh yeah, can't be a warm
You know,
cell. Sweating
you have
monks never happened.
you have your one candle to keep you warm. But it would no for me right now it'd be the phenomenology of spirit. It's just that book that I feel like every time I've tried to read it, I've almost glimpsed something amazing, and it never quite clicks. There are thinkers that I am convinced are that there are thinkers I'm convinced that don't make any sense deep down.
Mhm.
Hegel is the one that people often say. I'm not convinced that that's true of Hegel, and
Mhm.
I'd kind of like to get to the bottom of it. And so 3 months, 12-hour days, we just read Hegel. I feel like maybe I could get seriously close.
That's funny because for me, actually, right now, it's the same thing. I've been having this itch to get back to the phenomenology of spirit. Like I've worked through it a couple of times, and also a part of me that's animating that. For me, it's funny that we picked the same thing, and we did not conspire about this privately. Is that there's a new analytic study out of the phenomenology of spirit, which it's the first time an analytic philosopher has really like taken the phenomenology of spirit very
Is this the Brandon?
analytically.
Is this the Brandon book you're talking
Yeah,
about? Or
the
yeah, yeah,
like phenomenology of freedom, I think, or spirit of freedom.
a spirit of trust.
Yeah, spirit of trust.
Yeah, yeah. I've
Um,
got it sitting on my shelf. I haven't touched
yep.
it, but
Yeah, I haven't.
yeah,
I don't even have it. I just know it exists,
yeah,
and and yeah, I think the phenomenology also is a text I want to come back to because I've done a lot of Hegel, and um, yeah, the phenomenology is a text I
So
want to revisit.
I had one real Hegel experience in graduate school. I started my PhD program at a more continental department. I was there for
Hmm.
2 years, and my first semester I took like the most advanced level graduate seminar we had on Hegel, and it was taught by a visiting professor. And at one time, Boston University was like a great place for Hegel, and it was still a pretty good place for Hegel. But it was like Finley, the who
Yeah, yeah,
translated
I applied there. Yeah, I applied to
was
go
it
there.
was it
Yeah.
was it BU at one point. But this guy was an Italian visiting professor who had been at BU before, uh, and his idea of teaching Hegel was to tell us that in like the first 3 weeks of the semester, we should just read as much Hegel as we can. So
Yeah.
I was spending like like I thought my eyes were gonna bleed, and I read through like the Phenomenology of Spirit. No idea what I did. The Science of Logic, parts of the Encyclopedia of Logic, or Encyclopedia Logic, and parts of the Philosophy of Geist.
Yeah.
And it was too much. I overloaded myself,
No,
and I
it's
wrote a terrible paper. And I got the funniest comment I've ever received on a paper. He only wrote on the back. He left no line comments, and he wrote, "You have failed to engage with or understand Hegel. A minus."
yeah, yeah. It's uh, I've taken a lot of Hegel, and the phenomenology is a text that I still fail to fully understand. Like I've taught the philosophy of right. I've taught the greater and lesser logics, um, but you know there's yeah there's a way of reading Hegel that sort of shamanistic. Like you start from one text and go from the other, go from the other. And I always tell people start with the his lectures on the philosophy of history, and then
Mhm.
go from there. You know, the two other things I'll say that I would love to do is sort of monk out is the later Heidegger. I'd love to
Oh yeah.
read just later Heidegger. But
Is
the
that when he
other
was
thing I
like
would,
reading? Is that when he was like writing a bunch of about a bunch of like medievals and
yeah,
stuff? Or is
yeah,
that
it's when
the
he's
yeah
writing
yeah
Duns Scotus and like he's really his book on Parmenides.
yeah.
Uh, they are fantastic.
Mm,
Being in Time is fantastic in its own
mm,
way. And again, people, that's another thing I hate about being a modern philosophy too. Is like, oh, you can't read Heidegger because he was a Nazi. I'm like,
yeah
I am Jewish. Come
yeah
on.
yeah
Like,
yeah yeah yeah
genius is genius. Like,
yeah.
and it's unfortunate when genius is like morally compromised and like, but like also like Aristotle, Plato, and all those guys are having sex with underage boys. Like, are
Yeah,
we
yeah,
gonna
yeah.
like throw them under the bus because they were engaged in institutional pedestry? Like, there, yeah, I'm not here to cancel philosophy or philosophers. I'm here to like cultivate a relationship to genius and also be like, I would punch Heidegger in the face and also sit in his seminars. Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you can. So the later Heidegger is another thing I would study. Also, one thing I would love to do is I'd love to study Plato in the order. I'd love to have my brain erased and then study Plato in the order that the ancient Neoplatonics taught him. For
Oh, cool.
500 years, Plato was taught in a very specific order by the Neoplatonics, and we have not. And this is like this lasted for centuries, and I don't think anyone's ever studied him in that order. And this also includes things like the Alcibiades, which we now
Yeah.
think wasn't written by Plato, which I think probably was actually. But it's interesting to think that there was a curriculum.
I feel like that would be a great systematic study. Like a great
Yeah,
book could come of that.
yeah,
Reading Plato with history or something, something like that.
yeah.
I feel like I feel like that would be really good. I did this summer monk mode thing with Being in Time once between my first
Oh
and
yeah.
second year of graduate school. And the funny part was BU at the time also had a great Heidegger scholar, Dan
Mm.
Dahlstrom, who I was a research assistant for in my second year, but not about Heidegger. And eventually I told him that I had spent the summer reading Being in Time, and he said, "You really could have just taken my class."
I mean, I would say that um, again, it's like the phenomenological method. I think it is actually important to read it first
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then to do the secondary stuff.
yeah.
But did you guys did how do they do seminars in Heidegger? Did Being in Time, was it one seminar? Did you guys split it in half or
It was so there was sort of a standard seminar that got taught every 2 or 3 years that I think was basically just Division One.
right?
And then and a lot of BU seminars were co-listed with undergrads and grads, which I did not love. And I was glad to get away from that when I went to UConn. But that the Division One was like that. There were later Heidegger seminars that kind of just came and went based on
Mm,
demand and interest, where you might do the whole thing, or you might read other works, or you might
right.
just read Division Two, kind of depending on where Dahlstrom was at the time and what he was thinking.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of his PhD students, who was a friend of mine, almost wrote his dissertation on Heidegger's reading of Duns Scotus. Um, and luckily, Dahlstrom convinced him not to, and he managed to get a job. Because I feel like if he'd done that, he would have been like, this guy was like, he was a total hardcore atheist. He was like not interested in religion at all, but he would just sit in the grad student lounge and just go, and he would look at him and be like, what are you thinking about? And he's like, I'm thinking really hard about whether or not if I were a Christian, I would be a Catholic or a Lutheran. And this was all because he was reading
Reading
Heidegger.
Duns Scotus, Heidegger's Duns
Yeah.
Scotus. I
Yeah.
mean, again, Heidegger stuff on Parmenides, Heidegger stuff on Duns Scotus. I love that stuff.
Yeah.
I love Duns Scotus. It's funny because I'm not Catholic. I don't have a dog in any of these fights, but like sometimes I feel irked in a way, like vexed that there like aren't enough Scotians. So like I want to be like a, because I think Scotus gets it right and Thomas gets it wrong, and Thomas is
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
It's not fair that Thomas is the guy and whatever. But at any rate, yeah. But the late Heidegger, the second division of Being in Time, which I think is worrying. The being toward death stuff bothers me at some level,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not. The finitude stuff is super important, and
Yeah.
there is no building a bridge to existentialism until you read. I don't know. It's just
Yeah.
bizarre, like that the first division gets a lot of emphasis, and then again, it's like the weird thing we do with philosophy: you skip it, then move to existentialism. But there is no existentialism with the second division.
Yeah. I feel like maybe that's partly also a little bit of Dreyfus's influence because he
Yeah,
had those really influential Heidegger lectures, at least in the US, right?
right.
The sort he had those really influential Heidegger lectures that you could listen to at one point. You could just listen. You could listen to them all for free. They might still
Right.
be on YouTube,
I think they are.
but
Yeah,
he only taught on Division One,
yeah,
and most of his books are just Division One
yeah.
stuff.
Well, Division One's also like it's easier. Easier. It's a bit more handy. It is a
Yeah,
bit more
yeah,
like because it is more phenomenological. I think
yeah,
Division Two is much more fundamental ontology, and that's the direction he drifted in toward the late 20s, where he gets into what is metaphysics and all that
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah,
So it is a bit more heady.
yeah.
Jared, you just went full time on YouTube, man. Like you're
I did.
really like you're doubling down on YouTube. I
Mhm.
want to encourage folks who are watching, check out Jared's content. Smart stuff. Like again, like you're doing the philosophy thing and you're doing it in a way that I really enjoy. And I saw that you're going, doing YouTube full time. I'm like, this is the kind of guy that like I want to be throwing my support behind, because I think you're doing philosophy, and you're talking about philosophy in ways that have depth, that aren't 10-minute stoicism, but also you're like equipping people with the skills to do the work. So I just want to say, like, hey man, you're doing great work. I really want
I
to
really
encourage everyone to go check out your channel, support you. I know you have your Substack where
Mhm.
you're also doing a lot of writing, which I think is really important for people to support. So Jared,
Yeah.
where can we find you? Where can we find you? Where can
Yeah.
folks support your work? Let us know.
So first, thank you. But yeah, you can go you can go to my YouTube channel. I actually just launched channel membership. So if people like liked it enough and they don't care about my writing, and that's fine, they just like want to throw me a couple of bucks or something to help out, that's super useful. But the main way I ask people to support me these days is on Substack. So I don't do a Patreon. I just don't typically love the platform. It's just a preference. But I actually love to write, and if I have a reason to write, I just write like crazy. And so I'm probably publishing between like 5 and 10,000 words some weeks on the Substack because I'll just get up and just write a lot. I think maybe on the average weeks it's like closer to 5. And some of it is about I do these read-alongs where I'll just go chapter by chapter through works. Next week, actually, I'm starting a reading along of the Nicomachean Ethics.
Mm.
So we're gonna do 10 weeks on the Nicomachean Ethics, one week per book. But then I just write about a bunch of other stuff. I did a weird one-off little post today about why it's okay to be an amateur at lots of things and you don't have to be an expert about stuff. But then the one before that was about like using examples from Heidegger to talk about the intellectual life and like why you need to pursue silence and things. So which is similar to the whole monk mode discussion. So I'm just like kind of writing about whatever comes to mind, and I'm just writing a lot, and I think it's decent. So I'd ask you to go check it out.
Yeah, I would encourage folks to do it. And Jared, if you don't mind, if you could just like if you could put a comment in this stream when things are over,
Yeah, yeah, we'll
and
do.
I'll pin it, and like so folks can get you at all your links and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, folks, this channel is not just about cultivating esotericism. It's also about cultivating the a philosophical life. And folks know that I want to cultivate a world in which um, we can really have rich conversations, and this channel can be sort of an agora where like we can do lots of things. And yeah, Jared, I just want to appreciate you and the work you do, and thank you for your time to come hang out with me. And I think I'm going to hang out with your channel at some point and maybe talk about esotericism and philosophy or something at some point. But
Absolutely.
I'm just
Yeah.
one of the great things about this channel is that I literally left a comment in one of your videos, and I was like, "Hey, man, like let's brainstorm, let's do some things." And yeah, we figured it out, and we're doing the work of building, at least some possibility of a community of people who are thinking and doing it. And I appreciate you taking the time
I,
and the trust in me to come hang out.
I like to say that I've basically grown up in an age where every major institution has failed me, whether these and that the best solution I've ever found is to just build my own every time. And I think that using something like YouTube to build intellectual communities where you can have interesting conversations with other creators, with the audience, all of this is really the way forward for me. And so it's been a blast talking to you. So thank you so much. And we're going to definitely do it again in the future.
Awesome. All right, folks. Well, thanks so much for hanging out with both of us on a Wednesday evening. I'm again, apologies to my Europeans who are watching, who are not going to get this until tomorrow. But yeah, thanks everyone in the chat. I know there were some super chats. I'm sorry we could not get to those. I'll try to address those in a future chat. But yeah, thanks to everyone who watched. And yeah, be philosophical. And I don't mean that in some I really mean that in a really profound way. Like, this is a culture that wants you to be superficial and punch up and punch down to get your clout. Get your clout by getting depth and realness and bewilderment, and be unapologetically bewildered. So until next time, folks, see ya.